Have you ever said yes when everything inside you was screaming no? Have you ever felt like a terrible person just because you wanted to prioritize yourself for once? Have you ever carried invisible debts that no one actually asked you to pay, yet you keep paying them anyway, over and over until there's nothing left of you? Maybe you're exhausted from being the good son, the good daughter, the understanding friend, the selfless partner who never complains. Maybe you're tired of apologizing for existing, for having needs, for taking up space in a world that seems to demand you make yourself smaller every single day. But let me tell you something that no one has had the courage to say out loud. Guilt is not your conscience speaking. It's a weapon that was installed in you long before you could defend yourself, long before you even knew what was happening. And the person wielding that weapon, it's you. Or rather, it's a part of you that you don't even recognize, a voice so familiar you mistake it for truth. Sigmund Freud, the man who dared to say that your parents, society, and morality itself have been manipulating you since childhood, understood this better than anyone. He said that most people do not really want freedom, because freedom involves responsibility, and most people are frightened of responsibility. But it's worse than that. Most people are so terrified of guilt that they've built their entire lives around avoiding it, and in doing so, they've become prisoners of obligations they never chose. If you've made it this far, it's not by chance. This video is for you who are tired of sacrificing yourself for expectations that were never yours to begin with. But to break free, you'll need to face some truths that might make you deeply uncomfortable. And perhaps for the first time, this discomfort will actually set you free. Let's get started. You believe that guilt comes from doing something wrong, that when you feel that heavy weight in your chest, that sinking feeling in your stomach, it's because you violated some moral law, hurt someone, failed in your duties. But here's the brutal truth. You feel guilty even when you've done absolutely nothing wrong. You feel guilty for setting boundaries with your parents, for saying no to a friend's unreasonable request, for choosing your own path instead of the one everyone expected, for taking time for yourself instead of constantly helping others, for existing with needs and desires and limits like every other human being. What destroys you is not the act itself. It's the voice inside that judges you for it. That relentless, merciless voice that tells you you're selfish, that you're failing, that you're not good enough, that you should be ashamed. And here's what you need to understand. That voice isn't yours. It never was. Freud discovered that inside your mind, there's a psychological structure he called the superego. Think of it as an internal dictator, a harsh judge that punishes you more severely than any external authority ever could. It's not your conscience, not in the pure sense. It's an internalized parent, an internalized society, an internalized list of shoulds and musts that you swallowed whole as a child, without ever questioning whether they were true, whether they were fair, whether they were even meant for you. You still feel guilty because, on some level, you believe that feeling guilty makes you a good person. You think guilt proves you care, that it proves you're moral, conscientious, loving. But this is the trap. This is the illusion that keeps you enslaved. As long as you believe that other people's expectations should determine your choices, you will remain a hostage to guilt. Your freedom begins the moment you understand that guilt is not the voice of truth. It's the echo of old programming, running on autopilot, punishing you for crimes you never committed. And this programming runs deeper than you think. It was installed before you even knew what was happening in those early years when you were just trying to survive, to be loved, to be safe. This is what we need to explore now, how guilt became your master without you ever noticing. The biggest lie you've been told is that guilt is natural, that it's just part of being a good person, that everyone feels it the same way. Wake up, because that's not true. At least not the kind of guilt that's destroying you right now. Freud made this devastatingly clear. The superego is formed in early childhood through a process he called identification. You didn't choose your values. You didn't sit down at age 5 and decide what kind of person you wanted to be. You absorbed everything, from parents who punished and rewarded, from teachers who approved and shamed, from a society that needed you compliant, obedient, easy to manage. Here's how it happened. As a child, you wanted love and approval more than anything. You learned quickly that certain behaviors got you that love, while others got you withdrawal, coldness, punishment. So you began to internalize the punishing parent, to create an internal voice that would judge you before anyone else could, to protect yourself from external rejection by rejecting yourself first. And over time, that internal voice became harsher than the external one ever was. It became the superego, the heir of all those early authority figures, continuing to judge and condemn you long after they're gone, long after their actual influence has ended. You wonder why you feel crushing guilt for taking a day off while other people don't, because their superego was calibrated differently. Your internal judge is stricter, crueler, more demanding. And if it's this harsh, it's because somewhere in your childhood, love was conditional. Approval had a price, safety required perfection, and you've been paying that price ever since, even though no one's collecting anymore. Freud said, "Where it was, their ego shall be." But most people never make it that far. You're not consciously feeling guilt and then deciding how to respond. You're being punished by an automated system that you don't even know is running. And this system manifests in ways you don't recognize. You sabotage yourself when things start going well. You choose partners who criticize you. You overwork to prove your worthiness. You can't receive a compliment without immediately deflecting or giving something back. You apologize for existing. This is not love. This is not conscience. This is a psychological prison guard that you appointed yourself, and now it won't let you leave. But here's what makes this even more insidious. Most people's solution to guilt is to try to be better, to work harder, to finally become good enough. And that's exactly the trap, because the superego can never be satisfied. Let me show you why this approach will always fail. Most people believe that the way to escape guilt is by becoming perfect, by finally living up to those impossible standards. They build walls of achievements, create masks of selflessness, develop elaborate strategies of overgiving. They say, if I just do enough, give enough, sacrifice enough, the guilt will stop. But inside, they continue to bleed. They continue to corrode, because the problem was never about not being good enough. The problem is having an internal judge that cannot be pleased, that will not be satisfied no matter what you do. Freud was precise when he observed that the superego becomes more tyrannical the more you submit to it. Here's the devastating paradox. The more you try to satisfy your guilt, the guiltier you become. Every sacrifice proves you should sacrifice more. Every yes makes the next no harder. Every act of self-denial feeds the monster you're trying to appease. You take on everyone's emotions, their problems, their needs, thinking this will finally make you worthy. You mold yourself into whatever others want, believing this will earn you the right to exist. You become stricter with yourself than anyone else would ever be, hoping this will silence the voice. You apologize constantly for taking up space, for having boundaries, for being human, but none of it works. You cannot negotiate with the superego. It's not interested in fairness or balance. It's an internalized authority that exists to control, not to guide, to restrict, not to liberate. Your guilt isn't protecting you from being bad. It's preventing you from being alive, and you don't become free from guilt by being better. You become free by understanding that the game was rigged from the start. But that understanding requires you to do something terrifying. You have to question the very voice you've trusted as moral truth your entire life. And questioning isn't rejecting. Understanding isn't rebellion. What you need is not to become amoral, it's to become autonomous. But that autonomy requires you to look at something you've been taught to fear. The message hidden inside your suffering. Let's go there now. You learn to hate guilt, but you also learn to obey it, to treat it as sacred. Since childhood, you were taught that guilt means you care, that suffering for others is noble, that self-sacrifice is the highest form of love. And so you began to offer yourself up again and again, thinking each sacrifice would finally earn you peace, would finally prove you were good enough. But the more you obey guilt, the more it demands from you. And the worst part? It changes form. It disguises itself as anxiety about disappointing people, as resentment you can't express, as exhaustion you can't explain, as a vague sense that you're never doing enough no matter how much you give. Freud saw neurotic guilt differently. He believed it was a signal, not of moral failure, but of internal conflict, not between you and morality, but between your authentic self and the internalized demands of others. Guilt is like an unwanted guest that keeps knocking. Most people try to ignore it, distract themselves from it, or appease it by doing more, giving more, sacrificing more. But Freud would say, let it in, sit with it, ask it directly, who put you here? What are you really protecting, and whose voice are you actually speaking with? The truth is, guilt hurts so much because you are still at war with yourself. There's a part of you that wants to live according to your own truth, your own values, your own authentic desires, and another part that's terrified of being rejected, abandoned, or condemned if you do. There's something inside you crying out for autonomy, for the right to choose your own path, but your superego, still loyal to those old authorities, tries to suffocate that call. This is where the real pain is born, not from doing wrong, but from the friction between growth and obedience. Because choosing yourself feels like betrayal. Setting boundaries feels like cruelty. Saying no feels like you're abandoning everyone who needs you. But it's not. It's maturation. It's the necessary step toward becoming a whole person instead of a fragmented collection of obligations. When guilt strips you bare, When you can no longer sustain the performance of being good enough, you finally see the truth. The voice judging you isn't moral wisdom. It's old programming. It's the internalized parent who needed you obedient. It's the society that needed you compliant. And at that exact point, guilt can become sacred, not because you should feel it, but because it shows you exactly where you've abandoned yourself. Every wave of guilt is a map pointing to where you've prioritized others' approval over your own integrity, where you've silenced your truth to keep the peace, where you've made yourself small to make others comfortable. Freud said that one day, in retrospect, the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful, because it's in this struggle, this painful confrontation with the superego, that you begin to reclaim yourself. But this reclamation doesn't happen by accident. It requires a deliberate process, a conscious choice to dismantle what was built unconsciously. And I need to be honest with you, this path is lonelier and more brutal than anyone tells you. Few people have the courage to begin this journey of psychological liberation, and even fewer have the courage to complete it, because this path doesn't promise comfort. It doesn't protect your image as the good person, the selfless one, the one who never lets anyone down. It destroys the very structure you built to survive. Freud said the ego is not master in its own house. The superego has been ruling. Now you must reclaim the throne. You are not your obligations. You are not your sacrifices. You are not the role you've been playing to earn love, approval, or safety. All of this was what you created to survive a world that needed you small, manageable, and selfless. But surviving is not living, and freedom requires you to learn the difference between genuine moral feeling and neurotic guilt. Genuine guilt says, I violated my own values and I need to make amends. Neurotic guilt says, I exist, I have needs, I set boundaries, and therefore I deserve punishment. You must learn to tell them apart. You must identify whose voice the superego is actually speaking with. Ask yourself, is this my value, or is this what I was taught to value? Am I feeling guilty because I did something wrong, or because I disappointed someone's expectation? Would I judge a friend this harshly for the same thing? You don't eliminate the superego. That would be madness. You renegotiate with it. You take back authority. You decide what is truly important to you, not based on what was imposed, but on what you've consciously examined and chosen. You build a conscience based on your own values, your own examined principles, not on internalized commands from people who may have meant well, but didn't know you, didn't see you, didn't understand what you needed. This process comes at a price. Loneliness, not because you'll be alone, but because few people can accompany you here. Most are still trapped in the approval game, still performing goodness, still terrified of what it means to question guilt. And when you begin to free yourself, you inevitably distance yourself from those still imprisoned. But this distancing is not rejection, it's maturation. You don't distance yourself out of pride or superiority. You distance yourself because you no longer fit where you once hid. When you dismantle neurotic guilt, you don't become selfish. You become sovereign. You can still choose to help, to give, to sacrifice, but from freedom, not from fear. You can still care deeply about others, but without abandoning yourself in the process. You can still have strong values, but they're yours, consciously chosen, not unconsciously absorbed. You stop being a puppet of obligation and become a person of genuine choice. And that brings us to the only thing that can truly set you free. Not more discipline, not more sacrifice, not more trying to be good enough. Consciousness. Consciousness as the final and only liberator. Now that you've made it this far, there's something that needs to be said with absolute clarity. Nothing, absolutely nothing, will free you from neurotic guilt if you remain unconscious of how it operates within you. The obligations will keep appearing, the expectations will keep pressing, the voice will keep judging until you wake up. And awakening is not a magical event. It's a daily choice. It's catching yourself mid-apology and asking, what am I actually apologizing for? It's feeling the wave of guilt rising and pausing to ask, is this real? Or is this programmed? It's taking responsibility for your own choices without taking responsibility for everyone else's emotions, reactions, and disappointments. Freud said, where it was, there ego shall be. In other words, where blind obedience was, conscious choice shall be. You've spent your whole life resisting autonomy, the fear of being selfish, the terror of disappointing others, the anxiety of not being good. But what did that resistance give you? Exhaustion, resentment, a life half-lived, always at the service of a voice that can never be satisfied. True freedom from guilt is not hardness, it's clarity. It's not about rejecting all obligations. It's about choosing which ones are truly yours. It's not about becoming selfish, it's about becoming whole. When you understand your superego, its origins, its mechanisms, the exact tone and cadence of its voice, it loses power over you. You still hear it, but you don't obey blindly. You still feel guilt, but you question it. You still care about others, but you don't destroy yourself to prove it. What shields you from neurotic guilt is not trying to be good enough. It's understanding that good enough was always a rigged game, a moving target designed to keep you compliant. Those who live on the surface of unconscious obedience get destroyed by every expectation, crushed by every disappointment, shattered by every hint of disapproval. Those who dive deep, who question, who reclaim their own authority, they find stability, power, and genuine freedom in the depths. When you start living from consciousness, from examined values, from genuine choice, the world may try to guilt you. Family may say you've changed, friends may say you're being selfish, society may whisper that you're not doing enough, but none of it finds where to hit you anymore, because you've already asked the questions they fear. Says who, why, and do I actually agree? If this video touched something in you, if a part of you recognized itself in these words, write in the comments, I choose consciousness over obedience. Let's start a movement of people who no longer want to survive by performing goodness, but want to live with genuine integrity, with real freedom, with actual choice. And don't forget, the next video is also part of this journey. It's important. You need to keep going. Real transformation only begins when you don't stop at the first uncomfortable truth. Freud spent his life showing people that they were not as free as they thought. But he also showed them the path to actual freedom. The cage was always made of your own beliefs, your own internalized voices, your own unconscious programming, and you've always had the key. It's time to use it. See you in the next video. And remember, guilt is not your truth. It's just old programming waiting to be debugged.